Greetings. Let's focus our attention on Chapter 6, Biological and Psychological Theories, where we'll look at positivistic theory, biological theories, psychological theories, and the theory-policy connection. First, if we look at positivist theory, positivism is based, according to your author, is based on the idea that we can use empirical or scientific investigation for the improvement or the betterment of society. And your author points out that the basic premises of positivism are measurement or being able to quantify crime and social behavior, and objectivity or being neutral in our observations, and causality or determinism. In other words, being able to determine that one thing causes another thing to occur, that a certain characteristic causes crime, or certain characteristics, I should say, cause crime. The positivistic approach, again, is popular in criminology, and we'll see that throughout the course. And some of the earlier positivistic theories focused on areas like astrology or phrenology, or looking at the shape of the head, or looking at palm reading, or looking at atavism. For example, Lombroso believed that there were genetic throwbacks and they were also criminals. And we also saw ideas related to what was called feeble-mindedness, and also the whole area of eugenics, where we saw some horrific criminal behaviors conducted by physicians and hospitals in forced sterilization. We saw the eugenics carried out in Nazi Germany in many of the medical experiments and the scientific endeavors that were very criminal in nature, but a lot of that was based on the idea of the eugenic theories. So the earlier biological theories suggested that there was a genetic source for social behavior, for criminal behavior, and we saw that led to all kinds of problems in societies. Now, more recent biological theories focus on the nature versus nurture controversy, but really what we're seeing today is nature and nurture. That both the biological and the social really can be used together, and to separate them is creating a false duality that doesn't really help us much. But some of the biological theories look at situations like brain disorders, or particular genetic problems, or looking at certain characteristics of the structure of the brain, and also how the brain functions in terms of neurotransmission processes, and also possible links between certain types of mental disorders and crime, and also looking at dietary factors and environmental factors, as well as hormonal imbalances. So you really get a lot of different areas there, and there's been case studies, for example, there's one case that's often discussed about this man who basically led a non-criminal life for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden he started acting out sexually. He was evaluated, found he had a brain tumor. The tumor was treated. Then he went back to his non-criminal, non-deviant behavior. And then several years later, again, it started up again, and again the tumor had come back, so they treated that tumor. And so you get the idea there. And we're seeing really more of the neurological, biological connections starting to be made in the courtroom. For example, using fMRIs to look at brain scans and looking at what may be deficiencies in certain part of the brains as explanations for certain criminal behaviors, often violent criminal behaviors, when presented in the court. And we also know that the biological theories have been linked to a variety of policies. Some of the earlier biological theories led to lobotomies, or removing or severing certain parts of the brain from communication with other parts. And this whole psychosurgery situation has a long history in the United States. We also have seen the increase in use of pharmacology, specifically using certain medications to treat not only certain types of mental disorders, but also to treat certain types of violent behaviors as well. Although you may not see a lot of that in the literature right now, I can tell you from working in the field that psychiatric medications have been used to try to reduce violent impulses and behavior, whether or not the medication was created for that purpose or not. And there's a whole lot of debate about that. A lot of the neurobiological theories are criticized because they're often based on small samples, and often it creates this dualistic fallacy that it's all, in the head, basically, when it could be, or I think that many scientists argue that there may be clearly, biological and environmental connections in that situation. And often we have an over-reliance, as your author points out, on incarcerated populations. So we're looking at brains of prisoners in that sense. And again, this area has really been becoming more prominent in criminology-based research. Now, the psychological theories focus more on personality theories and behavioral theories. One of the earlier ones that probably everyone has heard about is Freudian theory, the psychoanalytic perspective. And Freud believed that there were three basic components of the personality: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id are those impulses. When I open up my refrigerator door and I see that quart of double chunk mint chip brownie pieces Ben and Jerry's, the id says, eat it, get it. The superego is really the morals and values of society, and so the superego in my head saying, no, you should not eat that because it's not yours. That would be wrong to take someone else's ice cream. And the ego kind of mediates between those impulses from the id and the superego, the morals and values of society, and it says, well, what can we do to satisfy that? And so maybe I go ahead and I go to the store and buy my own ice cream. Okay, so the Freudian theory still is used a lot, especially with defense mechanisms in discussions about crimes, such as some of the defense mechanisms, for example, denial, projection, repression, and there's a lot of use of Freudian theory in books and movies, and Freudian theory still is practiced today, but I don't believe that it is. It doesn't have the following that it did during Freud's time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Social learning theory is based on the idea that people learn how to commit crimes just as they learn how to engage in non-criminal behavior. And so there's a whole lot of different social learning theories, but in general, kind of to summarize, the idea here is that people learn because they're rewarded for pro-social behavior and punished for delinquent behavior. But also the opposite can occur, that kids, for example, can be rewarded for delinquent behavior and punished by their peers for pro-social behavior. And so people learn by observing others and looking at what happens when others engage in certain behaviors. They also learn how to think about what would be considered criminal and non-criminal and how to behave. And so we have a lot of those ideas as well. We also have some research out on IQ or intelligence and crime, and really a lot of the thought on that seems to be that what seems to be the big factor in looking at the intelligence and crime connection is really what happens in school, and if students fail in school and are labeled in negative ways, that really can lead to the increased risk of juvenile delinquency. And so there's a lot of things operating here. We also have the mental disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and then also two conditions which are really not formal diagnostic categories, the psychopath and the sociopath. And so there's a lot more of research out there and looking at the connection between antisocial personality disorder and criminal behavior, and also looking at psychopathy and also looking at sociopaths and the differences, because there certainly are differences between the diagnostic category antisocial personality disorder and also psychopathy, although there are some similarities as well. And then thinking about the theory-policy connection, your author points out that there's a shift from why do we have crime to why is this individual a criminal. And positivism really moved toward rehabilitation, helping the person, the individual, lead a crime-free or crime-reduced life through counseling and social support and exposure to pro-social peers and the like. So this is really a paradigm shift from punishment to rehabilitation. And of course, today we can begin to think about how we, as a society, explanations of crime is presented, and then how that leads to certain policies and procedures in criminal justice. And there's that tension often between rehabilitation and punishment. What do we do in certain cases? I can remember years ago, a state attorney asked me for some assistance with a case that he had, where he had a case where a person engaged in illegal behavior, but it was very bizarre, and he didn't want to bring it into a trial, and he was trying to think of other things, and he thought that if it did go to trial, it would lead to a very short sentence in jail, but he thought that the individual had some serious mental health issues, so we worked out appropriate referral to counseling, and they were able to go ahead and set up agreements to, with a plea bargain for counseling rather than, spending 3 months in jail. And so there's a lot of debate about that, and some would argue, well, the person should get counseling while in jail, and others say no, they shouldn't. And so I think really from the criminal justice perspective, what is useful is to think about how our theories support certain policies and what would be, some of the best options that we have based on the research. So we know some things that work, and we know some things that do not work. And what I will say, without getting into all the politics behind that, is clearly we still have policies out there as well as programs that have been shown not to work. And there's also some debate whether or not they actually create more problems. So that's why it's very important to bring in the research and to analyze these theory-policy connections and how these lead to helping us decrease crime versus, you know, either having very little or no effect, or even worse, having an increase in criminal behavior. So obviously this theory-policy connection also has politics operating very closely as well. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.